The story opens in Latin America, a place where kidnappings have become terrifyingly common. Every single hour, another person disappears, and most victims never make it back alive. Nearly 70% end up dead. Against that grim backdrop, former CIA operative John W. Creasy arrives in Mexico to reconnect with his longtime friend Paul Rayburn, another man who once lived in the same dangerous world. The two old friends sit together, carrying the invisible weight of their past. Creasy quietly wonders aloud whether God could ever forgive men like them for the things they were forced to do during their years in the CIA. Paul doesn't have an answer. Instead, he changes the subject and warns Creasy about his drinking, reminding him that alcohol is slowly destroying what's left of him. Curious about what his friend has been doing lately, Paul asks about his current life. Creasy admits there's nothing going on anymore, no purpose, no direction. Paul explains that wealthy families across Mexico City are desperate for protection because kidnappings are spreading everywhere. He tells Creasy that a powerful businessman named Samuel Ramos is looking for a bodyguard for his young daughter, Lupita Ramos, known to everyone as Pita. Samuel needs security for her, so the family's kidnapping insurance policy remains active. Paul believes Creasy is still one of the best men for the job, even if Creasy himself no longer believes it. The scene shifts to Samuel speaking with his lawyer, Jordan. The lawyer warns him that time is running out. Without hiring proper protection for his daughter, Samuel's insurance coverage will soon become invalid. Faced with no other choice, Samuel agrees to move forward with the arrangement. Eventually, Paul convinces Creasy to accept the assignment. Later, Samuel drives him through the city while reviewing his background file. Seeing Creasy's CIA history immediately impresses him. Samuel can't understand why a man with such experience would settle for bodyguard work when he could probably land a far more prestigious position. Creasy answers honestly. He says his drinking has gotten out of control, and once alcohol starts affecting your reflexes, you become useless for government operations. Samuel shrugs it off. He doesn't care about Creasy's flaws as long as his daughter stays safe. The only thing he asks is that Creasy avoids mentioning the drinking problem around his wife. Soon they arrive at the Ramos family home. There, Creasy meets Samuel's wife, Lisa, who instantly seems pleased that the new bodyguard is American. She calls for her daughter, and young Pita comes rushing over to greet him. Friendly and energetic, she immediately starts showing him around her room like he's already part of the family. While he quietly looks around, she casually mentions that he's actually her fifth bodyguard. The others all left eventually, and she hopes he won't disappear too. Although Creasy barely speaks and constantly looks weighed down by sadness, Pita quickly grows attached to him anyway. Her innocent personality slowly cuts through his cold exterior. She even names her teddy bear after him, calling it John Creasy. One afternoon, Creasy studies a map of Pita's school inside her room, trying to memorize routes and surroundings. Nearby, a noisy parrot keeps interrupting his concentration with non-stop squawking. Annoyed, he eventually opens the bird's cage and lets it fly away. The next morning, while driving Pita to school, she bombards him with endless questions. With complete innocence, she asks whether being a black bodyguard in Mexico is difficult. Creasy simply replies that time will answer that question. Pita then starts talking about the kidnapping crisis sweeping through the country, mentioning that 24 people have already been abducted just since the previous week. She keeps talking nonstop until they finally arrive at school. Just before getting out, she unexpectedly asks Creasy to come inside with her. He reluctantly agrees. Once inside, Pita introduces him to one of her teachers. The woman studies Creasy carefully for a moment before telling him that he looks deeply wounded inside, like someone haunted by terrible experiences from his past. She gently advises him to turn toward the Bible and begins reciting scripture. To her surprise, Creasy calmly continues the verses himself, proving he already knows them well. In that brief moment, she realizes this broken man has already spent a long time searching for peace. While Pita attends class, Creasy remains outside near the school grounds, patiently waiting. After classes end, he picks her up and drives her home. During the ride, her endless curiosity returns once again. She asks whether he liked school when he was younger. Creasy admits he didn't, joking that his school was nowhere near as impressive as hers and didn't have all the modern comforts and activities. But eventually, the non-stop chatter starts irritating him. Tired and emotionally exhausted, Creasy bluntly tells her that he's there to protect her, not become her friend. He asks her to stop asking so many questions. Hurt by the harsh response, Pita quietly moves away from him after the car stops and climbs into the backseat instead. Almost immediately, Creasy realizes he crossed a line and hurt her feelings. When they return home, Lisa attempts to make conversation with him, hoping to break through his cold demeanor. But Creasy shuts the attempt down politely yet firmly. He explains that he isn't a social person and only intends to focus on his responsibilities. Friendship isn't something he's interested in. That night, sleep refuses to come. The ghosts of his past keep clawing their way back into his mind. Overwhelmed by guilt, alcoholism, and emotional exhaustion from the life he once lived in the CIA, Creasy finally decides he's had enough. He takes out a gun and attempts to end his life, but when he pulls the trigger, the weapon misfires. Shaken, he immediately phones Paul and tells him what happened. Paul urges him to get himself together and keep fighting. Meanwhile, outside in the pouring rain, Creasy stands alone in the darkness, completely broken. Unbeknownst to him, Peta watches the entire moment silently from her bedroom window. For the first time, she begins to understand the pain hidden behind his hardened face. The following morning, Creasy drives Lisa and Peta to school like usual, but during the trip, something catches his attention. A suspicious car has been trailing them through the streets. Staying calm, he asks Peta for a pencil, but before he can do anything himself, the clever little girl quickly writes down the car's license plate number on her own. A few days later, Peta competes in a swimming tournament, and Creasy is there watching from the sidelines. She gives everything she has in the pool, but despite all her effort, she only manages to finish in third place. Disappointed and frustrated, she walks back to Creasy afterward and sadly tells him that she'll probably never be good enough to win. Instead of agreeing with her, Creasy calmly points out the real problem. He explains that she's actually faster than the other girls once she's in the water, but she hesitates before diving in, losing precious seconds at the start. For the first time, he doesn't speak to her like a bodyguard speaking to a client. He speaks like someone who genuinely wants to help her improve. As he starts coaching her and encouraging her to trust herself more, the bond between them deepens naturally. Around the same time, Lisa and Samuel leave town briefly, leaving Peta almost entirely under Creasy's care. He begins training with her seriously, pushing her to stop doubting herself. Eventually, the next competition arrives. By now, Creasy's cold exterior has softened. The little girl who once annoyed him with endless questions has become someone he cares about deeply, almost like a daughter. This time, when the race begins, Peta listens to everything he taught her. She dives without hesitation and finally wins. The moment fills both of them with genuine happiness. For perhaps the first time in years, Creasy smiles without forcing it. Soon afterward, Peta begins attending piano lessons, and Creasy drives her there as usual. But while waiting outside after dropping her off, he notices something alarming. The same suspicious car that had been following them before suddenly appears nearby again. At almost the same moment, two federal police vehicles block off the street. Creasy instantly senses danger. The second Peta exits the building, he urgently tells her to run. Within seconds, gunfire erupts across the street. Armed kidnappers and corrupt officers begin shooting as chaos explodes everywhere. Despite being badly outnumbered, Creasy fights back with deadly precision. He manages to kill 4 attackers, including the police officers involved in the ambush, but during the firefight, he is critically wounded. Before he can stop them, the kidnappers seize Peta and disappear with her. Afterward, while recovering from his injuries, authorities begin treating Creasy like a suspect instead of a victim. But investigative reporter Mariana Guerrero starts questioning the official narrative. She points out that the officers killed during the shootout weren't even supposed to be on duty that day, and several of them already had histories tied to corruption investigations. Meanwhile, AFI agent Miguel Manzano secretly relocates Creasy to a veterinary clinic to hide him from the corrupt police force that may want him dead. Soon, the leader of the kidnapping operation, a mysterious figure known only as the Voice, contacts the Ramos family and demands $10 million for Peta's return. Desperate to save his daughter, Samuel agrees to pay the ransom with assistance from Police Lieutenant Victor Fuentes, but the exchange goes horribly wrong. At the ransom drop, armed men ambush the kidnappers, and during the chaos, the Voice's nephew is killed. Furious, the kidnapper leader blames the Ramos family for the disaster and coldly informs them that Peta will now be lost forever as punishment. Mariana later explains to Creasy that the kidnapping network belongs to a massive criminal organization called La Hermandad, a hidden brotherhood made up of corrupt cops, government officials, and organized criminals all working together. Hearing this only hardens Creasy's resolve. He promises Lisa that everyone connected to Peta's disappearance will pay for it with their lives. Back inside Peta's room, Creasy searches through her belongings and reads her diary. There he discovers how much the little girl truly cared about him. Hidden among her notes, he also finds the license plate number she wrote down earlier, the same suspicious car that had followed them. He immediately contacts Mariana and asks her to investigate every detail connected to it. With help from Paul, Creasy gathers weapons, explosives, and equipment for what's coming next. Then the revenge begins. He captures one of the men tied to the operation, a gate guard connected to the kidnappers, and brutally interrogates him for information. To force the man to talk, Creasy cuts off one of his fingers before finally killing him once he gets what he needs. The information leads him to a nightclub connected to the organization. There, Creasy tracks down several members involved in the kidnapping. He kills a middleman known as Jersey Boy, along with another criminal, rescuing another kidnapped young girl in the process. During the attack, he also recovers an ATM card tied directly to the operation. Creasy hands both the rescued girl and the ATM card over to Mariana after calling her to the scene. During their conversation, she reveals another shocking truth. Lieutenant Fuentes himself is part of La Hermandad. At the same time, Agent Manzano questions Paul about Creasy. Paul describes his old friend as an artist of death, warning them that once Creasy commits himself to vengeance, he won't stop until every single person involved is destroyed. Eventually, Mariana convinces Manzano that helping Creasy may be the only way to expose the entire organization. Not long after, Creasy launches another brutal strike. Using a rocket-propelled grenade, he attacks Fuentes' convoy and abducts the corrupt officer. Once Fuentes is tied up, Creasy reveals that he has planted an explosive device inside the terrified man's body. Panicking, Fuentes quickly confesses everything. He admits that he ordered his men to interfere with the ransom exchange, but later discovered most of the ransom money had already been stolen by Jordan Calfus, Samuel Ramos' own lawyer. After extracting the information, Creasy detonates the bomb and kills Fuentes. Following the new lead, Creasy breaks into Calfus' house, only to discover the lawyer already dead and decapitated. While searching the home, he finds financial records and bank documents connected directly to Samuel Ramos himself. Creasy confronts Samuel and calls Lisa so she can hear the truth too. Broken with guilt, Samuel finally confesses everything. Calfus had convinced him to stage Peta's kidnapping so they could collect the insurance money and use it to pay off debts owed by Samuel's father. He insists they were promised Peta would never actually be harmed. But after the ransom ambush ruined everything, Samuel blamed Calfus for Peta's apparent death and murdered him in rage. Lisa is horrified. Completely unaware of her husband's involvement until now, she furiously tells Creasy to kill Samuel before she does it herself. Instead, Creasy leaves Samuel alone with a gun, along with the same bullet that failed when Creasy once tried to take his own life. Overwhelmed by shame and regret, Samuel finally turns the weapon on himself. Meanwhile, Mariana and Manzano trace the ATM card to the wife of the voice. Using the lead, Manzano's men secretly infiltrate her house and obtain a photograph of the mysterious kidnapper leader. Ignoring threats from La Hermandad, Mariana publishes the photo publicly and secretly gives Creasy the address connected to it. Creasy storms the location and takes the voice's wife along with his brother, Aurelio, hostage. During the confrontation, Creasy is shot in the chest, but before leaving, he finally learns the true identity of the voice, Daniel Sanchez. Creasy contacts Daniel directly and threatens his family. But Daniel shocks him with unexpected news. Peta is still alive. Daniel proposes a deal. He will return Peta safely in exchange for his brother Aurelio and Creasy himself. Without hesitation, Creasy accepts. He arranges for Lisa to meet him at the exchange point on a massive overpass. There, in the middle of the tense standoff, Peta is finally returned safely. Emotional and exhausted, Creasy embraces her and softly tells her that he loves her before sending her back into her mother's arms. As Daniel's men take Creasy and Aurelio away, the former CIA operative slowly succumbs to his gunshot wounds. But despite dying, he finally finds peace, knowing Peta survived. Not long afterward, Agent Manzano tracks down Daniel Sanchez and kills him, officially reporting that the criminal died during the course of the arrest. When people talk about revenge films from the 2000s, Man on Fire inevitably enters the conversation sooner or later. Maybe not immediately, maybe not with the instant recognition of something like Kill Bill. But give the discussion a few minutes and eventually someone mentions Creasy. And once that happens, the atmosphere shifts slightly, because this is one of those films that leaves behind an oddly persistent impression. The kind that lingers longer than expected. And honestly, part of that staying power comes from how unapologetically messy the film really is. This is not a sleek, perfectly calibrated action thriller where every frame feels clinically assembled. Man on Fire moves between emotional vulnerability and overwhelming intensity almost without warning. One moment it feels genuinely heartfelt. The next, it feels as though Tony Scott stormed into the editing suite with pure adrenaline running through his veins. The film constantly swings between extremes, and depending on the viewer, that's either exactly why it succeeds or exactly why it collapses under its own ambition. What's fascinating is that even people who dislike the film tend to remember it vividly. The imagery, the score, specific lines of dialogue, Denzel Washington walking through Mexico City looking spiritually exhausted before evolving into something that resembles vengeance in human form. There's something undeniably unforgettable about the film's atmosphere. Even its harshest critics usually acknowledge that much, and in 2004, revenge thrillers were everywhere. There were stylized revenge stories, comic book-inspired revenge stories, grindhouse-infused revenge stories, but Man on Fire occupied a different space entirely. It wasn't interested in looking effortlessly cool in the traditional Hollywood sense. The film felt overheated, heavy, emotionally bruised. The action often carried an unpleasant weight rather than straightforward excitement. Even the quieter emotional scenes seem wrapped in a lingering sense of inevitability, as though the story already understands that nobody is escaping untouched. That's probably one reason the film aged more gracefully than many expected. Beneath the explosions, fragmented editing, and relentless pursuit sequences sits an unusually tragic story about a man who emotionally considers himself finished long before the revenge narrative truly begins. At times, the kidnapping itself almost feels secondary. What audiences really remember is Creasy, this emotionally shattered former operative drifting through life like a ghost until a young girl unexpectedly gives him a reason to reconnect with the world around him. And once the film locks onto that emotional foundation, it becomes surprisingly difficult to pull away from. To be fair, though, the film has always divided audiences. Some genuinely consider this Tony Scott's masterpiece. Others view it as bloated, self-indulgent excess wrapped inside an aggressively overstimulated visual style. And honestly, both perspectives carry some truth. The film absolutely pushes too far at times. The editing can feel chaotic to the point of exhaustion. The runtime undeniably stretches itself. There are sequences where the style threatens to completely overpower the narrative beneath it. But at the same time, that excess is inseparable from the film's identity. It's difficult to imagine Man on Fire functioning as a restrained experience. It would almost lose the very thing that makes it memorable. Tony Scott directs the movie as though Creasy's internal world is disintegrating in real time. The camera trembles, drifts, crashes into faces, glides through crowds, burns with restless energy. Sometimes the effect is extraordinary. Sometimes it becomes overwhelming, but it never feels lifeless, and that's really the defining quality here. Even 2 decades later, Man on Fire still feels alive. Uneven, absolutely. Flawed, unquestionably. But alive in a way many polished modern action films no longer do. You can sense a filmmaker behind the camera making bold, aggressive creative decisions every few minutes, regardless of whether the audience fully embraces them or not. That's why the film continues to be revisited, not because it's perfect. In fact, perfection probably would have made it less memorable. People return to it because it carries scars, because it embraces rough edges, because it blends emotion, brutality, sentimentality, exhaustion, and style together in that unmistakably chaotic Tony Scott fashion. And somehow, against all reasonable expectations, it succeeds far more often than it probably should. One detail that sometimes gets overlooked about Man on Fire is that it's actually a remake. A surprising number of viewers either never realized that or discovered it years later and reacted with genuine confusion. Because yes, there was already a version of Man on Fire released back in 1987, starring Scott Glenn. And honestly, it's not a bad film at all. It belongs to that category of smaller, rougher revenge thrillers from the 1980s that never fully entered mainstream cultural memory, yet clearly contained the framework for something powerful underneath. You can immediately understand why Hollywood wanted another attempt at the material. The premise itself is naturally compelling: a broken man, a protection assignment involving a child, emotional attachment, tragedy, retribution. That structure almost works automatically if the casting and emotional execution are strong enough. What's interesting is that both versions actually share many of the same strengths and weaknesses, just expressed through completely different filmmaking philosophies. The 1987 version is leaner, simpler, less consumed by visual style. It arrives, tells the story efficiently, and exits before wearing out its audience. There's something admirable about that restraint. At times, it even feels more grounded despite operating firmly within the classic revenge thriller formula of its era. But then you watch Tony Scott's version and immediately understand why the 2004 adaptation became the culturally dominant one. It simply possesses more emotional force, more cinematic energy, messier energy, certainly, louder energy, occasionally almost overwhelming energy, but still, it reaches people more intensely, especially because of the relationship between Creasy and Peta. The newer version invests significantly more time developing that connection, and while some viewers argue that it slows the pacing considerably, that emotional investment is ultimately the foundation that allows the later sections of the film to resonate. Without that extended first act, the revenge narrative risks becoming little more than another story about an angry man pursuing criminals. The emotional context is what transforms it into something heavier, and apparently A.J. Quinnell, the author of the original novel, strongly preferred the 2004 adaptation, which honestly makes sense once the two films are compared directly. Tony Scott's version feels much closer to the emotional spirit of the source material, even preserving certain lines and character moments with notable precision. Quinnell reportedly disliked the 1987 version because he barely recognized his own work within it. And regardless of where people stand on Scott's visual style, the 2004 film undeniably feels more emotionally connected to the novel itself. At the same time, this is where the conversation becomes genuinely interesting. Because being the more faithful adaptation doesn't automatically make it the superior film. That's where audiences split sharply on Man on Fire. Some viewers see ambition, emotional depth, atmosphere, visual identity, tragedy. Others see a relatively straightforward revenge narrative stretched beyond its natural limits through hyperactive editing and stylistic excess. And honestly, both interpretations are understandable. The original adaptation almost suffers from excessive restraint. The remake suffers from refusing restraint entirely. One approaches the material too cautiously. The other behaves like a film on the edge of emotional collapse for nearly 2.5 hours. But strangely enough, that excess may be exactly what gave the remake its longevity. Because if we're being honest, people rarely revisit the 1987 version. Film enthusiasts know it exists, certainly, but it never embedded itself deeply into popular culture. Man on Fire absolutely did. Even people who strongly dislike it remember it with unusual clarity. The soundtrack. The fragmented subtitles appearing across the screen. Denzel Washington moving through Mexico City like the physical embodiment of consequence itself. The film left behind a far more permanent visual and emotional imprint. And that's probably the most important distinction between the two versions. The original tells the story. The remake experiences the story, aggressively, sometimes excessively. But that emotional overload is exactly why people are still discussing it 20 years later. One of the most uncomfortable aspects of Man on Fire, and uncomfortable in both effective and problematic ways, is its portrayal of Mexico City. The film almost immediately establishes the city as a place consumed by kidnappings, corruption, fear, and constant instability. And from that point forward, Tony Scott barely allows the audience a moment to settle. Every frame feels tense, overheated, drained of comfort. Even before the central narrative fully takes shape, the city already carries a sense of instability, armed security standing outside schools, wealthy families treating private protection as casually as another household expense, conversations about kidnappings unfolding with such routine familiarity that it almost becomes unsettling in itself. That atmosphere works immediately. You understand why someone like Creasy is even necessary in this environment. Visually, Scott leans into that paranoia with complete commitment. The film carries this scorched, restless aesthetic, harsh sunlight, grain-heavy textures, blown-out highlights, layers of yellow and amber saturating nearly every frame. Mexico City doesn't feel alive in the traditional cinematic sense here. It feels feverish, like a city functioning under permanent exhaustion and anxiety. There's a constant impression that everyone is operating on nerves and instinct rather than stability. A lingering sense of decay seems embedded into the streets themselves. To be fair, this eventually became one of the film's most heavily debated elements. For years, Hollywood repeatedly portrayed Latin America through heavily stylized, grimy visual filters, as though every location south of the United States needed to appear dusty, unstable, and perpetually on the edge of collapse. And Man on Fire absolutely falls into that tradition. There's really no denying it. Some viewers interpreted the atmosphere as immersive and emotionally effective. Others viewed it as bordering on exploitative. Honestly, it's understandable why reactions remain conflicted, because the film undeniably presents Mexico City as a city consumed by fear. Corrupt officials seem embedded everywhere. Criminal organizations operate openly. Wealthy families isolate themselves behind walls and security systems. Even the institutions designed to provide stability often feel compromised. By the time the film reaches its final act, nearly every surrounding system appears fractured in some way. What makes it more complicated is that the movie occasionally feels as though it wants to explore deeper social commentary, only to immediately redirect itself back toward revenge sequences and explosive confrontations. You can sense larger ideas existing beneath the surface: fear becoming normalized, wealth transforming into isolation, violence evolving into something systematic and transactional. Those themes are clearly present. But Tony Scott isn't making a restrained political drama. He's constructing an emotionally overwhelming revenge tragedy. So the city often stops functioning as a realistic location and instead becomes an emotional landscape reflecting Creasy's psychological deterioration. That's why the setting feels simultaneously immersive and heightened at the same time. And honestly, the film probably would not possess the same identity if it looked cleaner or safer. The atmosphere is inseparable from what gives Man on Fire its intensity. Danger feels constant. Even the quieter scenes carry unease beneath them. Creasy and Peta simply driving through traffic somehow feels tense long before anything actually happens. But there's undeniably another side to that approach. Some critics argued that the film reduced Mexico into little more than a backdrop of corruption and suffering in service of an American revenge narrative, especially because nearly every major threat emerges from criminal organizations or compromised authorities within the city itself. The film pushes those images so aggressively that even the ending dedication to Mexico City felt strange to some viewers. Almost contradictory, and yet, despite all of that, the setting undeniably functions on an emotional level within the film. You remember this version of Mexico City. That's the reality of it. Whether someone admires the atmosphere or questions what it represents, the film creates a world that feels dangerous from beginning to end. Not glamorous danger, not polished action film danger, something heavier than that, oppressive. As though violence is permanently waiting in the background for its next opportunity to surface. And for a revenge story built like this, that tension becomes essential fuel. Because when Creasy finally breaks and begins moving through the city like a man with nothing left to lose, it no longer feels like one individual invading a peaceful environment. It feels as though the city itself had already fractured long before he ever arrived. What truly makes Man on Fire work, or at least what prevents it from becoming just another revenge thriller, is John Creasy himself. Because underneath the explosions, the fragmented editing, the pursuit sequences, and all the overwhelming Tony Scott intensity, this is fundamentally the story of a man who emotionally collapsed long before the opening scene. And Denzel Washington plays him like someone carrying invisible weight every second he exists on screen, not in an exaggerated, theatrical way either. Creasy doesn't enter scenes announcing his pain to the audience. Half the time, he barely speaks at all. He simply looks exhausted, not physically exhausted, spiritually exhausted, like rest stopped offering relief years ago. The film introduces him as a former operative drifting through life with a bottle in one hand and absolutely no remaining direction. He drinks constantly. He isolates himself from everyone around him. There's this lingering sense that survival itself no longer interests him, and that he's continuing forward mostly out of routine rather than desire. Honestly, some of the quietest scenes in the entire film reveal more about Creasy than any of the later revenge sequences ever could. There's an early moment where he sits alone asking whether God can forgive him for the things he's done, and the film doesn't romanticize the question or turn it into some grand cinematic speech. It simply lets the silence sit there. Uncomfortable, heavy, you immediately understand this as someone who has spent years participating in terrible things and can no longer mentally escape them. That's what makes Creasy compelling. He isn't introduced as a stylish action hero, pretending to be damaged for dramatic effect. He genuinely feels like a man who has emotionally reached the end of himself. And one thing the film handles surprisingly well is that it refuses to rush his transformation. Some viewers absolutely believe the first half moves too slowly, and honestly that criticism makes sense. But the gradual pacing matters because Creasy doesn't suddenly become warm or emotionally open overnight. He resists connection constantly, especially with Peta. At first, he treats the assignment like emotional isolation. Drive her to school, maintain distance, avoid attachment, don't allow anything personal to develop. But Dakota Fanning's character slowly dismantles those walls in a way that feels surprisingly natural. Not through oversized emotional speeches either, through small conversations, jokes, questions, her complete refusal to feel intimidated by him, and Denzel Washington handles those scenes beautifully because the changes happen so subtly. You begin noticing small details first, Creasy smiling slightly more often, sitting differently, paying attention, caring despite every attempt not to. There's almost an uncomfortable realization unfolding inside him where he slowly remembers what it feels like to matter to another person again. Which honestly makes the second half tragic long before tragedy actually arrives, because the film is not truly about revenge. That's simply the surface level structure. What it's really exploring is a man briefly rediscovering humanity, only to have that fragile connection violently ripped away from him. The revenge itself becomes less about justice and more about a broken individual collapsing back into the only language he ever fully understood. Violence, and that's what makes Creasy such an unsettlingly fascinating character. The film constantly walks this delicate line where you emotionally understand him, while also recognizing that he becomes deeply frightening once his pursuit begins. When he starts tracking people down, he almost stops feeling entirely human at times. He becomes methodical, precise, emotionally cold in a way that's genuinely disturbing. And what matters is that there's no satisfaction visible in him while he does it. A lot of revenge films transform vengeance into empowerment fantasy. Creasy never appears empowered, he appears hollow. As though every act of violence simply confirms that this is all he was ever conditioned to become. Christopher Walken's description of Creasy as an artist of death initially sounds stylish and intimidating, but the film gradually reframes the phrase into something far sadder than impressive. Because Creasy himself clearly despises what he is, even his spirituality feels rooted in desperation rather than certainty. He speaks about forgiveness, judgment, and God, but never with confidence. More like someone desperately searching for proof that there's still a path back toward being human again. And Denzel Washington never overplays any of it. He keeps everything restrained just enough that the character remains believable, even when the film around him descends into hyper-stylized chaos. And honestly, that's the reason the performance anchors the entire movie. Without Denzel Washington grounding Creasy emotionally, Man on Fire probably collapses beneath the weight of its own style. But he gives the story an exhausted emotional center of gravity. You believe this man has lived through terrible things. You believe he's tired of himself. And you believe that protecting PETA unexpectedly awakened a part of him he assumed disappeared years ago. Which is why, by the time the revenge narrative fully takes control, it doesn't feel like an action hero beginning a mission. It feels like a man who lost the final good thing left in his life and genuinely no longer cares whether he survives what follows. The relationship between Creasy and PETA is the film. I honestly don't think Man on Fire functions without it. At all. Because if you remove that emotional foundation, what remains is essentially a deeply angry man moving through 2 hours of interrogations and retaliation. Some audiences would still enjoy that version, certainly, but it wouldn't carry the emotional resonance that keeps this film lingering in people's minds years later. What the film handles intelligently is that it refuses to rush the relationship. In fact, one of the most common criticisms surrounding Man on Fire is that it takes too long before reaching the kidnapping and revenge sections. But honestly, that slower first half is doing essential work. Creasy and PETA do not instantly become emotionally attached through some artificial Hollywood montage. At first, Creasy barely wants to engage with her at all. He remains polite enough, but emotionally distant. You can sense him actively trying not to care about anyone anymore. The assignment is supposed to remain simple: protect the child, maintain distance, collect payment. Then Dakota Fanning's character gradually dismantles those emotional barriers piece by piece. And one of the strongest aspects of the writing is that PETA genuinely feels like a child. She's curious, energetic, occasionally awkward, sometimes unintentionally irritating in the honest way children can be when they ask questions adults would rather avoid. But she never feels written like one of those overly polished movie children delivering dialogue with the emotional insight of a middle-aged therapist trapped in a smaller body. There's innocence there, warmth, restlessness. She feels authentic enough that you completely understand why Creasy slowly lowers his guard around her. The swimming sequences are probably the clearest example of this dynamic working so effectively. Because technically, very little is happening. There's no major plot development, no large-scale action. But emotionally, those scenes matter more than many of the explosive moments later in the film. Watching Creasy encourage her, train her, invest himself in her confidence, you can literally see dormant parts of him beginning to wake up again. And Denzel Washington plays those scenes perfectly because he never pushes the warmth too far. That restraint matters enormously. He doesn't suddenly become soft, comedic, or transform into some exaggerated father figure. The affection emerges quietly, a small smile, a brief joke. The way he starts paying closer attention when she speaks, the subtle shift in how he physically carries himself around her. you gradually realize that PETA may be the first thing in years making him feel useful in a human sense rather than a violent one. There's also this subtle sadness underneath all of it, because the film constantly reminds you that Creasy doesn't believe he deserves happiness. Even during the lighter moments, he still carries emotional heaviness with him. So every scene where he begins opening himself up feels fragile somehow, temporary, and honestly, Dakota Fanning deserves enormous credit for why the emotional core succeeds. A weaker performance and the entire film loses its foundation. Seriously, the revenge storyline depends completely on the audience believing this relationship mattered deeply enough to emotionally destroy Creasy once it's taken away. If PETA had come across as artificial or overly sentimental, none of the later violence would land with the same impact. But Fanning gives the character genuine warmth without making her feel manipulative. She's funny without sounding scripted. Even the smaller moments, piano lessons, conversations during car rides, swimming practice, gradually establish this emotional rhythm where the audience begins relaxing alongside Creasy himself, which makes the kidnapping sequence land far harder than it probably would in a conventional revenge thriller. Because by that point, the film has convinced you that Creasy didn't simply lose someone he was hired to protect. He lost the one relationship that temporarily rescued him from emotional ruin. That's why his response afterward feels so extreme, not necessarily justified, but emotionally understandable. And honestly, that's the major difference between Man on Fire and a lot of more generic revenge stories. Many films treat the emotional setup like an obligation to get through before the action begins. This movie genuinely cares about the relationship itself. The violence only carries emotional force because the first half spends so much time convincing you these two people authentically changed one another. PETA gives Creasy purpose. Creasy gives PETA safety, confidence, guidance, maybe even an emotional steadiness missing from parts of her own family life. The connection gradually stops feeling like bodyguard and client and starts feeling more like two lonely people unintentionally helping each other heal for a brief period of time. Which is exactly why the second half feels less like a revenge fantasy and more like grief transforming into violence. Denzel Washington is ultimately the reason Man on Fire survives its own excesses. Honestly, that's probably the simplest way to describe it, because this film constantly threatens to spiral entirely out of control. The editing is relentless, the visuals are chaotic, the violence reaches startling levels of intensity at times, and the runtime undeniably tests its limits. But Denzel repeatedly pulls the film back towards something emotionally grounded. What's interesting is that this isn't even one of his most traditionally showy performances. He's not delivering grand speeches every few minutes. He's not dominating scenes through theatricality. A huge part of why Creasy works comes from how profoundly exhausted Denzel allows him to feel. There's a permanent weariness embedded into the character, like years of regret have physically settled into his shoulders and spine. Even his movement tells you things. Early in the film, Creasy walks like someone who has stopped caring whether tomorrow arrives. He drinks excessively, barely engages with the people around him, stares into empty space for long stretches. There's an emotional numbness to him that Denzel never forces theatrically. He simply allows it to exist. And honestly, that restraint becomes the reason the later sections work so effectively once the violence erupts. Because when Creasy finally breaks, it doesn't feel like a movie character suddenly shifting into action mode. It feels like something damaged deep inside him finally giving way entirely. The rage feels ugly, focused, personal. There's a moment during one of the interrogations where Creasy stands over someone breathing heavily, barely containing himself, and Denzel does this incredibly subtle thing where he almost looks physically unwell from the hatred moving through him. Not stylized action hero anger, not cinematic swagger, more like a man who genuinely no longer knows how to stop once he begins. That's the version of Creasy people remember. Not just the man capable of violence, but the sadness existing underneath it. And the film wisely gives Denzel space to explore both sides of the character. You get the relentless revenge figure audiences associate with the movie, but you also get the quieter moments where he sits with PETA, helps her train, speaks awkwardly, and slowly rediscovers basic human connection. Those scenes matter because Denzel never transforms Creasy into an entirely different person. The emotional damage remains visible even during the warmer moments. That consistency is crucial. Some actors would have approached this role like two separate characters, the emotionally broken alcoholic in the first half, then the unstoppable action figure in the second. Denzel Washington blends both sides together seamlessly. Even at his most dangerous, Creasy still feels emotionally shattered. And I think that's exactly why audiences connect with him despite how extreme his actions eventually become. Because objectively, Creasy does deeply disturbing things throughout the film. Interrogations, executions, psychological intimidation. Man on Fire pushes surprisingly far with the severity of his actions. In another actor's hands, the character could have become completely alienating. But Denzel Washington gives him enough emotional pain and vulnerability beneath the brutality that you understand him emotionally, even when you probably shouldn't agree with him morally. There's also something fascinating in the way Denzel makes Creasy feel intelligent without exaggerating it. He never performs the role like a comic book super assassin. Creasy observes, calculates, speaks carefully. Even his threats often arrive with unsettling calmness, which honestly makes them more intimidating than if they were delivered with explosive anger. And then there's the chemistry with Dakota Fanning. That relationship only works because Denzel understands exactly when to completely lower the intensity. Around Peta, Creasy becomes quieter, slightly uncertain at times. You can almost feel him remembering how to exist around another person again. Those scenes humanize him far more effectively than any exposition ever could. What's interesting is that some people occasionally criticize Denzel for always bringing a recognizable Denzel Washington energy into his performances. And honestly, I understand what they mean. He has an unmistakable screen presence, but Man on Fire may actually be one of the strongest uses of that persona because Tony Scott structures the entire film around it instead of resisting it. Creasy needs that quiet authority, that constant feeling that violence could emerge at any second even while he's standing completely still. And when the second half finally unleashes him fully, Denzel somehow makes the transformation feel both frightening and tragic simultaneously, which is genuinely difficult to pull off. Most revenge thrillers encourage the audience to celebrate vengeance as a kind of cathartic fantasy. Denzel plays Creasy as though every violent act is stripping away another remaining fragment of his humanity. Even when he succeeds, there's never a sense of triumph, just momentum, obsession, emotional ruin. By the end, Creasy no longer feels like an action hero at all. He feels like a man who briefly rediscovered a reason to live, and then willingly transformed himself back into a weapon the moment that reason disappeared. Dakota Fanning had an incredibly difficult role in Man on Fire, and honestly, I don't think that gets acknowledged enough. Because the entire emotional foundation of the movie depends on whether the audience believes Peta is worth all of this devastation. Every explosion, every revenge sequence, every emotional breakdown, every act of violence, all of it only works if viewers completely believe the connection between her and Creasy. And somehow, as a child actor surrounded by extremely heavy material, Dakota Fanning entirely holds her own. What's most impressive is how natural she feels throughout the film. Especially when you remember how many movies from that era struggled to write children like actual human beings. A lot of child characters either became overwhelmingly cute or strangely adult, delivering dialogue no real child would ever naturally say. Peter avoids that trap almost entirely. She talks too much sometimes. She asks uncomfortable questions. She gets excited easily. She's playful, emotional, curious. She feels like an intelligent child, rather than a screenwriter's manufactured version of one. And that distinction matters enormously because it allows her relationship with Creasy to feel authentic instead of emotionally engineered. And honestly, Fanning's confidence on screen is remarkable when revisiting the film now. She's acting opposite Denzel Washington, a performer with enormous natural gravity, and she never disappears beside him. In some scenes, she actually controls the emotional rhythm entirely. There are moments where Creasy barely speaks, and Dakota carries the entire scene through energy, timing, and presence alone. The swimming sequences are probably the clearest example of that dynamic. She brings warmth and enthusiasm that slowly pulls Creasy back toward life, whether he wants it or not. And importantly, she accomplishes this without making the performance feel overly sentimental. That's the key detail. The film comes very close to becoming emotionally manipulative in certain places, but Dakota keeps the relationship grounded because she plays Peta like a genuine child instead of a symbolic emotional device. Even the smaller details contribute to that realism. The way she speaks quickly when she's excited, the way she constantly tries to break through Creasy's emotional distance. The random conversations in the car that feel slightly messy and natural instead of perfectly polished. It creates chemistry that feels surprisingly lived in very quickly. And honestly, chemistry is the most important word here. Because what makes Man on Fire memorable isn't simply that Creasy wants revenge after she's taken away. It's that the audience genuinely believes these two people changed each other emotionally. You understand why Creasy becomes attached to her. More importantly, you understand why losing her psychologically destroys him. That only works because Dakota Fanning makes Peta feel emotionally real. And one of the smartest aspects of her performance is that she never tries too hard to appear dramatic. There's no constant scene-stealing child actor intensity, no exaggerated emotional breakdowns clearly designed to force audience reactions. Even during difficult scenes, she stays surprisingly restrained, which somehow makes the performance land even harder, because the innocence feels genuine. And once the film takes that innocence away from Creasy, the emotional atmosphere changes permanently. What's also interesting is how many critics, even people who dislike the movie overall, still single out Dakota Fanning's performance for praise. That's usually a sign that a performance is doing something structurally essential. She becomes the emotional anchor holding together a film that constantly risks drowning in its own stylistic intensity. Without her, Man on Fire probably becomes emotionally cold. That's the reality of it. The movie is filled with violence, corruption, exhaustion, and moral decay, and Dakota brings the one consistent source of emotional light into it, not in an artificial or sentimental way. Just enough humanity to remind the audience what Creasy is trying to protect in the first place. And honestly, that's why the second half works emotionally instead of merely mechanically. If viewers didn't care about Peta, then Creasy's pursuit would feel like just another brutal action thriller gimmick. But because Dakota Fanning spends the first half making Peta feel alive, funny, innocent, and deeply likable, the violence afterward carries genuine grief underneath it. You don't simply understand Creasy's rage, you feel the absence that created it. One thing Man on Fire quietly handles extremely well is surrounding Denzel Washington with a supporting cast that becomes memorable almost immediately, even if the film doesn't always fully utilize all of them afterward. Because this is one of those movies where recognizable faces keep appearing, and you almost pause for a second realizing how many strong performers are actually here. Christopher Walken, Mickey Rourke, Giancarlo Giannini, Radha Mitchell, Mark Anthony. There's an impressive collection of talent throughout the film, and the unusual thing is that most of them still leave a strong impression despite relatively limited screen time. Christopher Walken especially. Honestly, Walken could probably read grocery lists and still make them memorable, but Man on Fire uses him in a surprisingly restrained way. He isn't performing the exaggerated eccentricity audiences often associate with him. Rayburn feels exhausted, experienced, like another man who has spent too many years around violence and learned to normalize it simply to survive. And he delivers what is probably the most iconic line in the entire film. Creasy's art is death, and he's about to paint his masterpiece. That line should not work. On paper, it sounds absurdly dramatic, but Walken delivers it with such calm certainty that it suddenly transforms Creasy into something almost mythological before his revenge campaign has even fully begun. It became one of those moments permanently fused into the identity of the film itself. At the same time, though, you do find yourself wishing Christopher Walken had more scenes, and honestly, that applies to much of the supporting cast. The film introduces several genuinely compelling characters, only to repeatedly pull the focus back toward Creasy's emotional descent before fully exploring them. Take Giancarlo Giannini, for example. He brings a grounded calmness to the film that helps stabilize some of Tony Scott's more chaotic energy, while many of the surrounding characters feel emotionally unstable or morally compromised. Giannini's character feels observant, measured, controlled. At times, he almost functions as an audience surrogate, watching Creasy move through the city with this mixture of admiration, concern, and quiet disbelief. Then there's Radha Mitchell, who honestly deserves more recognition in conversations about the film, because her role could have easily been reduced to generic, concerned mother material, but she gives Lisa enough emotional sincerity that the family dynamic actually feels believable. The scenes between her and Creasy carry this subtle awkwardness that works extremely well. There's a sense that she understands who Creasy is before he fully understands himself again. Mark Anthony is interesting too because he brings an undercurrent of nervousness to the father character. You never feel entirely certain how much emotional trust to place in him, and the film intentionally lanes into that uncertainty. There's guilt surrounding him almost constantly, even before the story begins revealing deeper layers beneath the kidnapping itself. Then there's Mickey Rourke, who is probably the clearest example of unrealized potential in the movie. It's strange because Rourke feels like exactly the kind of performer who should dominate a revenge thriller with this much emotional darkness, but the film barely uses him. He drifts in and out of the narrative before the audience has much opportunity to fully connect with the character at all. And honestly, several supporting characters suffer from that same issue. The movie becomes so consumed by Creasy's psychological collapse that other potentially fascinating figures occasionally end up feeling underdeveloped by comparison, the villains especially. That's probably one area where Man on Fire feels weaker than it could have been. The individuals behind the kidnapping operation are dangerous, certainly, but very few of them become truly memorable as characters. Most function primarily as targets within Creasy's relentless pursuit rather than fully realized antagonists with strong psychological presence, which works in terms of maintaining revenge momentum, but it also flattens some of the dramatic tension. Because the film isn't particularly interested in the villains themselves, it's interested in what Creasy becomes while pursuing them. And honestly, that creative decision probably makes sense for this specific story. Man on Fire isn't structured like a traditional cat-and-mouse thriller where charismatic masterminds dominate the narrative. The emotional perspective remains attached to Creasy almost the entire time. Nearly every supporting character exists in relation to his collapse, redemption, grief, or vengeance. Still, what helps the supporting cast stand out is that the actors themselves bring texture and emotional weight even to smaller scenes. Christopher Walken brings weary wisdom, Giancarlo Giannini brings quiet intelligence, Radha Mitchell brings emotional grounding, Dakota Fanning brings warmth. Even brief appearances carry personality because the cast understands the unusual emotional tone the film is pursuing. And honestly, that becomes incredibly important in a movie this stylistically aggressive. Because without strong performances beneath all the fragmented editing, heightened visuals, and relentless intensity, Man on Fire could have easily collapsed into pure sensory overload with no emotional center holding it together. Instead, even the smaller performances help the world feel inhabited by people carrying their own exhaustion, fear, guilt, or survival instincts, which makes Creasy's movement through that world feel heavier and far more human. One of the most fascinating things about Man on Fire is how unusual its structure actually is for a revenge thriller. And honestly, that structure is probably the reason some audiences absolutely love the film, while others become frustrated with it long before the credits arrive. Because this movie takes its time, really takes its time. If you enter Man on Fire expecting Denzel Washington to become a relentless revenge force within the opening 20 minutes, the film almost feels like it's deliberately refusing to deliver what you anticipated. The kidnapping, the actual inciting event most people associate with the movie, doesn't even occur until roughly an hour into the runtime. And when you think about it, that's genuinely surprising. Especially because the marketing presents the film as non-stop vengeance from the very beginning. But the first half is much quieter than audiences often remember. For long stretches, it functions more like a character drama than an action thriller. Watching Creasy drift through life, gradually connect with PETA, awkwardly rediscover pieces of his humanity, that's the real focus early on. And honestly, I think that slower build is simultaneously the film's greatest strength and one of its most noticeable weaknesses. Because emotionally, the setup absolutely works. The movie spends enough time developing Creasy and PETA's relationship that when everything finally collapses, it genuinely hurts. You understand exactly what has been lost. The revenge later carries emotional weight because the film earned it instead of rushing through the connection like narrative obligation. But at the same time, there are definitely moments where you feel the runtime stretching itself. Certain scenes linger slightly too long. Some conversations revisit emotional themes the audience already understands. The film occasionally circles around the same ideas of guilt, loneliness, and redemption without necessarily deepening them further. You can sense Tony Scott wanting the emotional bond to land completely, but there are moments where the pacing almost starts resisting itself, and then the kidnapping happens. What's strange is that once the movie shifts fully into revenge thriller territory, it almost transforms into an entirely different film. The tone changes dramatically, the structure changes, even the energy changes. Suddenly, the story becomes this chaotic progression of interrogations, betrayals, confrontations, discoveries, conspiracy threads, and escalating acts of retaliation unfolding one after another. The movie stops observing emotionally and starts moving almost entirely through momentum. And depending on the viewer, that second half either becomes incredibly gripping or completely overwhelming. Personally, I think the film works best when it remains emotionally centered on Creasy, rather than attempting to become overly complicated narratively. Because once the investigation aspect of the story begins layering in hidden motives, corrupt officials, ransom schemes, betrayals, and reveals surrounding who's involved, the film occasionally loses clarity. Not confusion exactly, more like emotional focus getting buried underneath narrative escalation. There are a few later twists that some viewers genuinely admire and others strongly dislike. Certain reveals push the story into territory that feels almost melodramatic compared to the grounded emotional setup established earlier. And you can definitely sense the screenplay trying to continually escalate the mystery elements in order to sustain intensity. Sometimes that approach works beautifully. Sometimes it feels like the film doesn't entirely trust its emotional core enough to carry the second half by itself. What's fascinating, though, is that despite all the structural unevenness, the film rarely becomes dull, uneven. Absolutely excessive, probably, but boring, not really. Tony Scott's direction simply refuses to remain still long enough for that to happen. Even when the narrative becomes tangled, there's always emotional tension or visual intensity pulling the story forward. And because Denzel Washington keeps Creasy emotionally grounded beneath all the chaos, the audience remains invested even through some of the more excessive narrative detours. I also think the film deserves real credit for delaying the revenge payoff as long as it does. A weaker version of this movie would have rushed directly into violence because that's the simplest audience hook. Man on Fire understands that the revenge only matters if we first spend enough time watching Creasy become emotionally vulnerable again. The first half of Man on Fire is essentially constructing emotional stakes piece by piece so the second half can dismantle them violently. That's why the tonal divide feels so dramatic. The beginning is about connection. The latter half is about what happens after that connection is torn away. And honestly, even though the film probably could have removed 20 minutes without seriously damaging itself, I still respect how committed it remains to its emotional pacing. It's messy, absolutely, occasionally indulgent, but it never feels mechanical, like a studio checklist being completed scene by scene. It feels like Tony Scott genuinely wanted the audience emotionally invested before unleashing all the revenge thriller chaos people came to see, which is probably why the structure continues to divide audiences so strongly. Some viewers see an overextended action movie desperately trying to appear deeper than it really is. Others see a revenge story that actually took the time to establish emotional consequences before pulling the trigger. And strangely enough, both interpretations exist inside the film simultaneously. Now we do have to talk about the runtime, because even many people who genuinely love Man on Fire eventually arrive at the same conclusion: this movie is too long. Or maybe the more accurate way to describe it is that it feels too long in certain sections. There's a difference. What's unusual about the film is that it doesn't move like a traditionally slow movie. Tony Scott directs everything with such relentless energy: the editing, the soundtrack, the camera movement, the constant visual aggression, that the film often feels frantic even during scenes where very little is actually happening. And yet somehow, despite all of that intensity, there are stretches where you still begin feeling the weight of the runtime, especially in the middle sections. The film runs close to 2.5 hours, which is a substantial amount of time for what is, structurally speaking, a fairly straightforward revenge narrative. A broken man bonds with a child. The child is taken from him. The broken man systematically dismantles everyone responsible. At its core, the story itself is actually quite simple. But Man on Fire keeps expanding outward emotionally and stylistically at the same time. Scenes linger, conversations stretch, emotional beats repeat themselves. The movie circles around Creasy's pain again and again, almost as if Tony Scott is trying to immerse the audience inside his exhaustion completely. Sometimes that approach works beautifully. Other times you start quietly thinking, all right, I understand this man is damaged. We can continue moving now. And honestly, the pacing issues become more noticeable because the film is already emotionally heavy from beginning to end. This isn't a breezy action film where the runtime disappears because the atmosphere feels entertaining or playful. The mood here is oppressive almost constantly. Even the quieter scenes carry sadness, guilt, or tension beneath them. So when the narrative begins slowing down or revisiting familiar emotional territory, you genuinely feel it. The first half receives the most criticism for this. A lot of viewers expected the kidnapping to happen significantly earlier, and honestly, that reaction makes sense. Modern revenge thrillers usually rush toward the inciting event as quickly as possible. Man on Fire spends nearly an hour building Creasy and Peta's relationship before detonating the narrative entirely. Personally, I think that emotional investment is essential. The revenge later simply doesn't function without it. But even I'll admit there are moments where the film probably could have tightened itself without sacrificing emotional impact. Then, interestingly, the second half develops almost the opposite issue. Once Creasy fully begins his pursuit, the film suddenly becomes relentless. Information overload, interrogations, shootouts, new revelations, more compromised officials, more betrayals, more names, more side characters. The pacing accelerates dramatically, but the movie still keeps moving forward relentlessly. And because Tony Scott shoots everything at maximum emotional intensity, the experience can actually become exhausting by the final act. Not boring exhausting, sensory exhausting, like your brain has spent over 2 hours absorbing flashing imagery, fractured editing, heavy music, emotional trauma, violence, and psychological collapse without pause. The film almost intentionally wears the audience down, which, to be fair, probably reflects Creasy's mental state quite accurately, but that doesn't always make it easy viewing. There's also a strong sense that Tony Scott simply became too emotionally attached to the atmosphere to remove anything from it. You can feel him wanting every emotional beat, every stylistic flourish, every visual experiment, every moment of suffering to remain intact. And honestly, that's part of what makes Man on Fire memorable. Personality spills out of nearly every frame, but personality and discipline are not always the same thing. A tighter version of this film probably exists somewhere. A version maybe 20 minutes shorter that lands even harder emotionally. A version where repetitive emotional beats are streamlined, side plots are simplified slightly, and a few stylistic detours are trimmed away. But then again, maybe that version also loses some of the strange emotional intensity people still remember, because Man on Fire almost feels swollen with grief from beginning to end. The runtime contributes to that feeling in a strange way. You spend so much time trapped inside Creasy's damaged emotional state that by the conclusion, the movie feels less like a clean revenge thriller and more like prolonged emotional attrition. And honestly, that's why reactions to the pacing vary so dramatically. Some viewers see an overindulgent action film desperately needing a stronger editor. Others see a movie deliberately forcing the audience to sit with pain, obsession, guilt, and emotional deterioration longer than most Hollywood thrillers would ever dare. I honestly think both interpretations are true. The film absolutely could have been leaner, no question. But I also think part of Man on Fire's identity comes directly from the fact that Tony Scott refuses to let the audience escape the emotional weight quickly. The film lingers inside misery, anger, exhaustion, and grief until it almost becomes uncomfortable. And whether viewers admire that commitment or become frustrated by it, that's usually the exact moment where they decide whether they love this movie or cannot stand it. Once Man on Fire fully transitions into revenge mode, the film becomes genuinely unsettling. And I don't mean exciting action movie unsettling. I mean there are moments where it feels deeply ugly in ways most Hollywood revenge thrillers intentionally avoid. Because Creasy doesn't simply eliminate people, he punishes them, and that distinction matters. A lot of revenge films transform violence into audience wish fulfillment. The protagonist becomes an unstoppable force, and the audience is expected to celebrate each enemy taken down through increasingly inventive methods. Man on Fire definitely contains traces of that operatic intensity. Tony Scott absolutely shoots certain sequences with almost mythic energy, but underneath all the style, something significantly darker is moving through the film. Creasy looks emotionally hollow through much of it. That's what makes the violence feel different. There's no enjoyment visible in him, no swagger. Even when he's completely in control, Denzel Washington plays Creasy like a man functioning entirely through grief, obsession, and momentum. The revenge doesn't restore him. It feels like it's consuming whatever remaining humanity he still possesses, and the film pushes surprisingly far with that descent. Interrogations evolve into torture. Threats evolve into executions. Bodies accumulate constantly. There's one sequence involving explosives that still catches audiences off guard because of how casually horrifying the moment feels. The movie keeps escalating the brutality until you begin realizing this is no longer simply a revenge narrative. It's a portrait of someone who has completely surrendered himself to violence. Which is exactly why the moral ambiguity becomes so fascinating, because the film absolutely wants the audience emotionally aligned with Creasy. The people he's pursuing are kidnappers, predators, compromised officials, objectively terrible individuals. The movie carefully constructs antagonists the audience will not hesitate to despise. And yet, the methods Creasy uses become so extreme that the film occasionally pushes the audience into deeply uncomfortable territory. You understand him emotionally, but should you fully support him? Man on Fire never completely answers that question. And honestly, I think that uncertainty is part of why the movie lingers in people's memories far more than standard revenge thrillers usually do. It never feels emotionally clean. Creasy is not portrayed like some righteous figure restoring order to the world. He feels more like a man dragging himself deeper into psychological ruin because revenge is the only thing still keeping him emotionally functional. Christopher Walken's "artist of death" line becomes more disturbing the longer the movie continues. At first, it sounds undeniably iconic. Then gradually, you realize the film is treating violence almost like Creasy's final remaining language. The one thing he truly understands, the one thing he can still execute with precision, and that realization feels tragic far more than heroic. What's fascinating is how divided audiences remain on this aspect of the film. Some viewers see Man on Fire as emotionally justified vengeance, a brutal but cathartic story where monstrous people finally face consequences. Others believe the film crosses into outright sadism, lingering too heavily on suffering and punishment while simultaneously presenting itself as morally thoughtful. Honestly, both interpretations exist within the movie at the same time. Tony Scott clearly loves the intensity of these sequences. You can feel the filmmaking becoming almost feverish during the revenge scenes. Loud music, fragmented editing, hyper-stylized confrontations. The film absolutely wants the audience to feel the force of Creasy's rage, but Denzel Washington's performance keeps grounding everything emotionally enough that the violence never fully slips into cartoonish spectacle. It remains uncomfortable, and I think the reason it works for so many people is because the revenge is tied directly to grief rather than ego. Creasy isn't trying to prove his strength. He isn't reclaiming status or reputation. He isn't delivering smug action movie one-liners after every confrontation. Most of the time, he seems emotionally exhausted, even while carrying out these horrifying acts. The revenge feels less like empowerment and more like self-destruction with a direction attached to it. That changes the emotional tone completely. Even the famous line, "Forgiveness is between them and God. My job is to arrange the meeting," perfectly captures the film's strange moral atmosphere. It sounds undeniably powerful. Of course it does. But it also reveals how emotionally detached Creasy has become from ordinary humanity by that point in the story. He has reduced himself into an instrument of punishment, and the film never entirely pretends that transformation is healthy or admirable. That's why Man on Fire feels different from more straightforward revenge fantasies like Death Wish or many modern action thrillers. It's not simply interested in vengeance as entertainment. It's interested in what vengeance does to someone psychologically, the emotional cost of becoming consumed by it. Now, whether the film always explores that theme gracefully is an entirely separate debate. Sometimes it absolutely indulges in the brutality, a little too enthusiastically. There are moments where Tony Scott seems fascinated by suffering in ways that edge close to exploitation. But even during those moments, sadness still exists underneath everything. And honestly, that's the part that stays with me, not the explosions, not the executions, not the shock value. It's the feeling that every violent act Creasy commits pulls him further away from the version of himself PETA briefly helped him rediscover. Underneath all the gunfire, revenge, fractured editing, and overwhelming Tony Scott visual intensity, Man on Fire is really about a man trying to determine whether his life still possesses any value at all. That's the emotional center of the story, not revenge, not kidnappings, not even justice, really, redemption. And what makes the film interesting is that it treats redemption as something painful rather than inspirational. Creasy does not go on some clean emotional journey where he learns to love himself again and walks away healed. The movie never believes life operates that neatly. Every step toward becoming emotionally human again feels difficult for him, almost uncomfortable. When we first meet Creasy, he already appears spiritually exhausted, not simply sad, finished. Like someone who spent years participating in terrible things and finally reached the point where he can no longer numb himself effectively enough to survive emotionally. Alcohol barely helps. Isolation barely helps. Even conversation feels heavy to him. Then PETA enters his life almost accidentally, and the film handles that relationship in a way I genuinely appreciate because it's never framed as some magical emotional cure. PETA doesn't suddenly repair Creasy's life. What she does is remind him there's still a version of himself capable of caring deeply about another human being. That's different. You can actually watch the conflict unfolding inside him throughout the first half. He wants emotional distance. He tries to remain detached, but gradually, almost against his own instincts, he begins reconnecting with the world through her. Through routine, through trust, through tiny moments that would seem insignificant to almost anyone else, helping her train, listening to her talk, watching her smile after succeeding at something. Those scenes matter because they give Creasy something he lost a very long time ago, purpose disconnected from violence. And honestly, that's why the second half lands with so much emotional force. Because when Peter is taken away, it's not simply the loss of a child he was protecting. It's the destruction of the one thing that briefly made him feel emotionally alive again. The film understands something important about grief. Grief is not always passive sadness. Sometimes grief becomes obsession, sometimes it becomes rage, sometimes it becomes self-destruction. Creasy's revenge mission turns into this deeply distorted form of emotional resurrection. But here's the tragic part. The only skills he still fully possesses are violent ones. That's what makes the movie sadder than a conventional revenge thriller. Creasy tries to reclaim meaning through vengeance because vengeance is the only emotional language he still knows how to speak fluently. He knows how to protect, he knows how to punish, he knows how to eliminate threats, but emotionally reconnecting with ordinary life, that's much harder for him, and the film constantly frames this tension through religion, sacrifice, and guilt. Creasy speaks about God repeatedly throughout the movie, but never with certainty. More like someone desperately searching for absolution he doesn't fully believe he deserves. The famous forgiveness line sounds cold and intimidating on the surface, but underneath it there's this lingering sense that Creasy stopped believing forgiveness was personally available to him a long time ago. So instead, he transforms himself into punishment, which makes the ending emotionally complicated in a way I genuinely admire, because Man on Fire never treats sacrifice as triumphant, it feels inevitable. Creasy spends nearly the entire film behaving like a man who emotionally accepted death before the story even began. The difference is that PETA gives that death meaning. For the first time in years, he is something worth suffering for beyond his own guilt. That's why the emotional core survives despite all the excess surrounding it. The movie is loud, violent, stylistically overwhelming at times. But underneath all of that noise is a surprisingly intimate story about a damaged man discovering love too late to completely save himself from what he had already become. And honestly, I think that's why audiences connect with Creasy even when the film pushes everything to extremes, because most people understand the desire for redemption in some form. The need to believe your mistakes did not entirely erase your humanity. Creasy simply exists at the most violent possible end of that emotional spectrum. The film also understands something many revenge stories completely ignore. Love and violence can become dangerously connected inside grieving people. Creasy's love for PETA is pure, but once she's gone, that love mutates into something destructive because he has nowhere else to place the pain. The revenge does not replace the love. It's what happens when the love survives, but the person doesn't. And that's why Man on Fire remains emotionally heavy even during its action sequences. Because underneath every interrogation, every explosion, every act of retaliation, there's still a grieving man desperately trying to convince himself that his life meant something before it ended. One of the more fascinating aspects of the film is that, depending on how you interpret it, it can either feel like a straightforward revenge thriller or an unexpectedly uncomfortable reflection of postminus 9/11 American psychology. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure Tony Scott consciously intended all of those layers to exist, but once you notice them, they become difficult to ignore. Because the movie arrived in 2004, that timing matters. America was deeply immersed in the eliminate the enemy at any cost era. The war on terror dominated the cultural atmosphere. Surveillance powers expanded rapidly. Political rhetoric increasingly framed global conflict through almost religious ideas of good versus evil. The belief that extreme violence could become morally justified if directed toward the right targets had become deeply embedded in popular culture during that period. And Man on Fire absolutely taps into that emotional climate. Creasy is essentially a former government instrument, an ex-operative shaped by secrecy, violence, and morally compromised missions. The film repeatedly hints at terrible things from his past without fully spelling them out. He's a man created by systems that trained him to neutralize threats efficiently and without hesitation. Then, once PETA is taken from him, that machinery gets unleashed again. The movie frames everything emotionally, of course. This is personal grief, personal rage, personal devastation, but politically, there's another layer underneath it. Creasy decides ordinary rules no longer apply because the evil he's confronting is too monstrous for traditional justice to handle. And honestly, that idea feels very familiar within the context of the early 2000s. He invades privacy, threatens people, tortures suspects, uses fear as leverage, operates entirely outside legal structures. And the film frequently presents those actions as understandable because the targets are kidnappers, predators, and corrupt criminals. It creates a moral framework where brutality becomes acceptable if directed toward the correct enemies. That's one reason some viewers found the movie politically uncomfortable, especially because the film constructs its world in a very specific way. Mexico City is portrayed as unstable, dangerous, and deeply compromised. Institutions barely function, law enforcement cannot be trusted, criminal networks seem everywhere, Meanwhile, Creasy, despite being psychologically shattered, becomes this almost mythological force of punishment, cutting through the corruption with absolute certainty. There's definitely a reading of the movie where it functions as an American revenge fantasy projected onto a foreign setting. And honestly, the film occasionally leans into that imagery quite aggressively. Peta herself almost operates symbolically within the story, blonde, innocent, emotionally pure, surrounded by threatening environments and predatory systems. Once she's harmed, the film unleashes Creasy like an instrument of righteous vengeance. Even the religious language matters here. Creasy constantly speaks about God, forgiveness, judgment, but the way the film uses religion sometimes feels less spiritual and more ideological. Almost as if violence is being framed as morally sacred because it's directed toward evil people. The famous "forgiveness is between them and God" line sounds incredible dramatically, but politically it also reveals something dangerous. The belief that one individual can appoint himself judge, jury, and executioner because traditional systems have failed. And again, that mentality resonated strongly within early 2000s culture. You can feel the era embedded inside the film. At the same time, though, I don't think Man on Fire entirely celebrates that worldview either. And honestly, that's what makes it more interesting than many simpler revenge thrillers. Creasy never looks triumphant while doing these things. He looks damaged, emotionally hollow, haunted. The violence never restores him psychologically. If anything, it drives him further into self-destruction. So the movie exists in this morally uneasy space, where it simultaneously indulges revenge fantasy while also exposing the emotional corrosion underneath it. And honestly, that ambiguity is probably one reason people still debate the film so intensely. Because if Man on Fire were purely propaganda for violent justice, it would feel much simpler emotionally. But the story constantly reminds the audience how broken Creasy already was long before the revenge ever began. He isn't portrayed as a healthy moral hero restoring order. He's portrayed as a deeply traumatized man using violence because it's the only remaining purpose he fully understands. That doesn't necessarily erase the political implications underneath the film, but it complicates them significantly. There's also the question of representation. Some critics argued the movie reduces Mexico into a landscape defined almost entirely by corruption and criminality while positioning American-style violence as the solution. And honestly, I understand that criticism too. The film spends very little time exploring the social complexity behind the kidnapping crisis itself. Instead, it primarily uses the environment as emotional fuel for Creasy's psychological and violent journey. Which means your political response to the film probably depends on which emotional layer affects you more strongly. Do you see a tragic story about grief, sacrifice, and redemption? Or do you see a revenge fantasy shaped by early 2000s fear, paranoia, and punishment culture? The uncomfortable truth is that Man on Fire contains both simultaneously. You also cannot discuss Man on Fire without discussing Tony Scott's direction, because this movie doesn't merely have a visual style, it practically overwhelms you with it. The most famous line is obviously, "Forgiveness is between them and God. My job is to arrange the meeting." Honestly, that line should not work as well as it does. Read without context, it almost sounds like something pulled from an aggressively dramatic internet quote compilation. But Denzel Washington delivers it with such cold exhaustion that the meaning changes completely. He doesn't say it with pride. He says it like a man who emotionally crossed a line years ago and stopped questioning where that path would eventually lead him. And that's why the line works. It's not simply cool dialogue. It reveals who Creasy has become. And honestly, the film is filled with moments like that. The screenplay keeps framing Creasy almost like a tragic myth wandering through the city rather than a conventional action protagonist. Christopher Walken's famous "Artist of Death" speech is probably the clearest example. Creasy's art is death, and he's about to paint his masterpiece. Again, absurdly dramatic on paper. But Walken delivers it with this eerie calmness that suddenly transforms Creasy into something larger than life. The film begins feeling less like a grounded thriller and more like a revenge legend spreading through the city before Creasy has even fully arrived. What's interesting, though, is that the quieter dialogue is often just as important. The conversations between Creasy and Peta are what give the film emotional legitimacy in the first place. Without those softer scenes, all the revenge dialogue later would feel emotionally hollow. Their exchanges aren't polished into perfect cinematic speeches. Sometimes they stumble naturally, small jokes, awkward questions, tiny moments of connection, and that contrast matters enormously, because once the second half begins, the dialogue becomes colder, harder, more fatalistic. It's almost like Creasy emotionally seals himself off again and starts speaking almost entirely through threats, ultimatums, and detached observations about death. And Denzel Washington's delivery carries so much of that emotional weight. He understands something incredibly important about revenge thriller dialogue. The quieter certain lines are delivered, the more dangerous they become. Creasy rarely screams his threats. That would almost make him less intimidating. Instead, he speaks with this eerie calmness that makes violence feel inevitable before the other person even responds. That restraint creates tension long before anything physically happens. There's also this strange poetic quality running throughout sections of the screenplay, references to God, forgiveness, death, sacrifice. The film constantly frames revenge almost like religious ritual. Sometimes it works beautifully. Other times it absolutely risks tipping into self-parody. And honestly, I think Man on Fire survives those moments because the actors commit completely. Nobody delivers these lines with irony. Nobody winks at the audience. Tony Scott directs every emotional beat with total sincerity, and the cast follows that tone without hesitation. If even one performance leaned sarcastic, the entire emotional atmosphere would probably collapse instantly. Now, to be fair, not every line in the movie lands perfectly. There are moments where the screenplay strains a little too aggressively toward profundity. Some dialogue sounds more emotionally powerful than it actually is intellectually. And occasionally the movie becomes so obsessed with sounding intense that scenes drift close to melodrama. But strangely enough, that excess becomes part of the film's identity. Because Man on Fire is not trying to sound realistic all the time. It's trying to sound emotionally scorched. The dialogue feels like it belongs inside this overheated world Tony Scott created, where grief, violence, religion, and obsession are constantly colliding with one another. And honestly, the film probably wouldn't be nearly as memorable without those lines. People don't simply remember the plot of Man on Fire. They remember how it talks, the threats, the weary observations, the fatalistic philosophy embedded inside Creasy's conversations, the sense that every sentence carries emotional damage underneath it. That's why the dialogue lingers, not because it's subtle or restrained, but because the film commits so completely to transforming Creasy into this tragic, exhausted figure wandering through a world where every sentence feels one step away from violence. Brian Helgeland's screenplay for Man on Fire is one of those scripts where the strengths and weaknesses are tangled together so tightly that separating them almost becomes impossible. Because on one hand, the screenplay gives the film its emotional backbone. Without Helgeland slowing the first half down and genuinely building the relationship between Creasy and Peta, the entire movie collapses into empty revenge spectacle. That emotional foundation is the reason audiences still care about the film instead of merely remembering a few violent moments before moving on. But at the same time, the screenplay absolutely overreaches in places. And honestly, I think that tension is exactly what makes the movie so interesting to revisit years later. The smartest thing Helgeland does is understand that Creasy's revenge only matters if the audience first watches him become emotionally human again. The screenplay spends a surprising amount of time allowing ordinary moments to breathe: car rides, swimming lessons, small conversations that don't necessarily advance the plot conventionally but slowly build emotional trust between characters. A weaker revenge script would have rushed through all of that to reach the violence faster. Man on Fire doesn't. The screenplay is patient enough to let Creasy feel emotionally dead before showing Peta gradually pulling him back toward life. That's why the emotional devastation later actually lands. You believe this relationship mattered deeply to him. You believe he changed because of her. And honestly, Helgeland writes Creasy extremely well overall. There's a sadness embedded inside the character that prevents him from becoming just another damaged assassin cliché. Even when Creasy says something intimidating or severe, the screenplay usually leaves space for emotional exhaustion underneath it. He never fully feels like someone enjoying what he's doing. Violence feels more like habit than empowerment, and that distinction matters enormously. The screenplay also does a strong job making the world feel interconnected. Information flows naturally from one character to another. Corruption spreads through multiple layers of society. Certain objects, phrases, and details return later with genuine narrative purpose. Even when the investigation structure becomes messy, there's still an underlying sense that Brian Helgeland wanted the conspiracy to feel connected rather than random. Now, where the screenplay struggles is probably the exact same place the entire film struggles. Excess, the second half keeps escalating and escalating until it almost risks collapsing beneath its own emotional weight. More revelations, more betrayals, more hidden connections to the kidnapping network. Some of it works beautifully. Some of it definitely feels overcomplicated for what is, emotionally speaking, a fairly simple story, and there are a few twists that divide audiences sharply. Certain reveals push the film into territory that feels almost too melodramatic compared to the grounded emotional setup established earlier. You can feel the screenplay trying to maintain momentum and surprise simultaneously, but occasionally it stretches credibility a little too far in the process. That's where reactions to Man on Fire really begin splitting apart. Some viewers see a layered revenge thriller carrying emotional and moral complexity underneath the violence. Others see a relatively thin revenge narrative being inflated through stylistic excess and narrative detours. And honestly, I understand both reactions because the screenplay genuinely contains both versions of the movie at the same time. There's also this fascinating contradiction in how Helgeland approaches social commentary. The script clearly wants the kidnapping epidemic and institutional corruption in Mexico to feel serious. The movie constantly references fear, moral decay, compromised systems, and societal instability. But at the same time, the screenplay is far more emotionally invested in Creasy's personal revenge journey than it is in deeply exploring those larger issues. So the social themes sometimes function more as atmosphere than fully developed commentary. And then there's the dialogue, which honestly walks a very dangerous line throughout the film. Some of it is exceptional, genuinely memorable, emotional without feeling artificial. But other moments push so aggressively toward mythic intensity that they almost drift into self-parody. The screenplay loves dramatic reflections about death, punishment, forgiveness, sacrifice. Sometimes those lines land perfectly because the actors commit completely. Other times you can feel the script reaching a little too hard for legendary status. But strangely enough, I think that ambition is part of why the film survived culturally. Because even when Man on Fire becomes messy, it never feels emotionally lazy. Brian Helgeland isn't writing a mechanical revenge script where characters simply move from one action scene to another. He's trying to build emotional tragedy underneath the brutality. Sometimes the movie achieves that beautifully. Sometimes it overcomplicates itself trying to sound deeper than it actually is. But the effort is visible constantly. And honestly, I would rather watch an ambitious screenplay with rough edges than a perfectly polished revenge film that disappears from memory 10 minutes after it ends. That's kind of the story of Man on Fire as a whole, really. The script isn't flawless. It's overlong, occasionally indulgent, sometimes too melodramatic for its own good. But underneath all of that is a genuinely emotional story about grief, guilt, redemption, and self-destruction, trying very hard to exist inside a brutal revenge thriller. And most of the time, against all odds, it actually works. The thing that made Man on Fire so divisive over the years isn't simply the editing or the runtime or even the violence alone. It's the strange emotional line the movie constantly walks between sincerity and exploitation, because there are moments where this film feels genuinely heartfelt. And then 5 minutes later, Tony Scott is blasting industrial music over a torture sequence while subtitles explode across the frame, and you suddenly find yourself wondering, wait, is this movie grieving right now or enjoying itself? That tension never completely disappears. And honestly, I think your reaction to Man on Fire depends heavily on which side of that balance affects you more emotionally. Because if you emotionally connect with Creasy and Peta's relationship, the film becomes deeply sad. Their bond feels authentic enough that once tragedy arrives, the revenge carries genuine grief underneath it. You understand why Creasy fractures psychologically. You feel the emotional emptiness driving him forward. The movie becomes less about stylized vengeance and more about a damaged man destroying himself because he lost the one thing that briefly gave his life meaning. That version of the film absolutely works for me at times, especially during the quieter scenes, the small conversations, the swimming lessons, the awkward emotional warmth between Creasy and Peta. Those moments feel sincere. Not calculated, Tony Scott surprisingly shows restraint there. He allows silence and vulnerability into a movie that otherwise often behaves like emotional warfare directed at the audience. But then the film also clearly loves intensity, deeply. The revenge sequences become stylized to the point where the movie occasionally feels intoxicated by violence, even while simultaneously trying to mourn it. Torture becomes theatrical. Explosions become emotional punctuation marks. The camera lingers on suffering with this strange mixture of horror and fascination. And that's where critics began accusing the movie of exploitation. Because there's a completely valid argument that Man on Fire wants emotional credit for grief, while simultaneously transforming revenge into spectacle. The film tells you violence is tragic, while also staging that violence with enormous cinematic energy and style. That contradiction is impossible to ignore. There are scenes where Creasy's brutality genuinely feels disturbing and emotionally ugly. Then there are other moments where the filmmaking becomes so aggressive that the audience is clearly being pushed toward excitement too. The movie sometimes wants revenge to feel horrifying and cathartic simultaneously, which honestly mirrors real human emotion more closely than people usually admit. Grief and rage are messy. Revenge fantasies often emerge directly from pain. Man on Fire understands that emotionally, but it also risks indulging those fantasies so intensely that viewers start questioning the morality of the film itself. And I honestly think Tony Scott intentionally keeps the movie emotionally unstable because of that. The film never settles fully into one emotional mode. It refuses to become a clean moral drama. One moment Creasy feels tragic and deeply human. The next moment he feels mythological, almost superhuman in his capacity for violence. Sometimes the movie critiques vengeance. Sometimes it practically worships it. That's why people still debate the film 2 decades later, because you can genuinely interpret it in multiple ways. Some viewers see a heartfelt story about redemption, sacrifice, and grief wrapped inside an aggressive revenge thriller. Others see a stylish exploitation film pretending to be emotionally profound while indulging heavily in torture and masculine violence. And honestly, both versions exist inside the same movie. What keeps Man on Fire from tipping fully into empty exploitation for me is Denzel Washington. He grounds the movie emotionally enough that the suffering still feels connected to human loss rather than pure spectacle. Creasy never looks emotionally triumphant while carrying out revenge. He looks broken, haunted, exhausted, and that sadness matters because it constantly pulls the film back from becoming pure action fantasy celebration. But even then, Tony Scott sometimes pushes so aggressively stylistically that the movie risks undermining its own emotional sincerity. The fractured editing, the pounding soundtrack, the overwhelming visual intensity. There are moments where the film almost transforms grief itself into sensory spectacle. And depending on the viewer, that either makes Man on Fire emotionally overwhelming or emotionally manipulative. Honestly, I think the movie ultimately lives or dies on whether you accept that contradiction, because this is not a restrained meditation on violence. It's an emotionally excessive film about excessive emotion. Tony Scott has no interest in subtle grief. He's interested in grief that erupts outward violently and infects every frame of the movie itself. Sometimes that approach feels raw and genuinely powerful. Other times it feels like the film is using pain as visual fuel for style. But strangely enough, the fact that the movie never fully resolves that tension may actually be the reason it remained memorable. It feels emotionally dangerous in ways many polished revenge thrillers simply do not. You're never entirely comfortable with what the film wants you to feel. And honestly, I think Man on Fire is probably at its strongest precisely inside those uncomfortable emotional spaces. What's especially interesting is that the film never became one of those universally accepted, great movies. It never settled comfortably into that category where everyone collectively agrees on its brilliance. Even now, people still argue about it almost scene by scene, and honestly, I think that's part of why it survived, because the movie leaves marks on people, sometimes meaningful ones, sometimes frustrating ones. But it rarely leaves viewers completely neutral. When Man on Fire first arrived, reactions were all over the place. Some critics absolutely rejected it. They found Tony Scott's direction unbearable, the editing exhausting, the violence excessive, the runtime bloated. To them, the film felt like emotional manipulation wrapped inside hyperactive filmmaking techniques. And then there were the viewers who connected with it deeply, not because they believed it was technically flawless. Honestly, most fans of the movie will still admit it's messy, but because something about the emotional intensity lodged itself underneath their skin. Denzel Washington's performance, the relationship with Peta, the grief underneath the violence, that strange collision between tenderness and brutality. For many audiences, Man on Fire became one of those movies that lingered emotionally long after the credits ended. And that divide never really disappeared either. Even today, you'll still find people calling it Tony Scott's masterpiece, sitting directly beside people describing it as 2.5 hours of over-edited chaos. And honestly, both sides usually make valid arguments. That's the strange thing about the film, because it absolutely is excessive, it absolutely overreaches. The runtime is too long, the visual style can become exhausting. Certain twists stretch credibility, the violence occasionally edges into outright sadism. None of those criticisms are unfair, but at the exact same time, the movie also has personality pouring out of every frame. And that matters more than people sometimes realize. A lot of technically better, revenge thrillers released around that era disappeared from cultural memory because they felt manufactured. Man on Fire never feels manufactured. It feels emotional, chaotic, overcommitted, like Tony Scott and Denzel Washington threw themselves into the film completely without worrying whether every decision would satisfy everyone. And that gives the movie a strange kind of longevity, because revisiting it years later, the flaws are still there. Honestly, some of them become even more obvious with time, but strangely, so do the strengths. The emotional core still works. Denzel Washington's performance still lands with enormous emotional force. Dakota Fanning still grounds the story beautifully. The atmosphere still feels unique. And maybe most importantly, the movie still feels alive. That's probably the highest compliment I can give it. So many early 2000s action thrillers feel trapped inside their era now. Man on Fire somehow still feels emotionally raw. Maybe because Tony Scott's style was already so aggressive and unconventional that it never fit neatly into trends to begin with. The movie almost exists on its own emotional frequency. Even people who dislike it usually remember it vividly. The quotes, the music, the subtitles flashing violently across the screen. Creasy limping through Mexico City looking spiritually destroyed. Christopher Walken speaking about death like poetry. The film burned itself into people's memories whether they wanted it to or not. And honestly, that's legacy, not perfection. Memorability. I also think that's why the movie became more respected over time. Not necessarily because audiences suddenly decided it was flawless, but because they realized there genuinely wasn't another revenge thriller quite like it. You can imitate pieces of Man on Fire, the fragmented editing, the hyper-stylized violence, the emotionally driven revenge structure, but recreating the exact emotional atmosphere is much harder. Because underneath all the excess is this strange sincerity. The movie genuinely believes in Creasy's pain. It believes in grief, in redemption, in sacrifice, in guilt, even while surrounding those themes with sensory overload and brutal violence. And that sincerity prevents the film from feeling disposable. Honestly, I think that's why people continue revisiting it after 20 years, not because it's comfortable viewing. It really isn't. The film can become emotionally exhausting and stylistically overwhelming, but there's something magnetic buried underneath all that chaos, something emotionally unstable and deeply human. You watch Man on Fire, and it feels like you're watching filmmakers push emotion as far as they possibly can inside a revenge thriller, even when the result becomes messy, excessive, or borderline self-destructive. Sometimes it works beautifully, sometimes it crashes directly into the wall at full speed, but either way, you remember it.